The servants were likely just as happy to be left alone. As she wandered, Maomao spotted a dog one with a familiar keeper, so the mutt had brought his mutt. It was Lihaku, who was a rather large and friendly dog himself. Wondering what he was doing there, Maomao went over and squatted beside him. He was rubbing the dog's belly. When he realized someone had approached him, a suspicious look crossed his face. "Hello," he said. "Hello," Maomao replied. That voice, oh, he clapped his hands and nodded. "Young lady, it's you. What are you doing here?" And she looked so much lovelier than usual too. "So glad you finally noticed." She had no freckles and she wasn't wearing her usual outfit, so he seemed not to have realized it was her at first. He was a man who knew how to be rude as ever. "Yeah, but seriously, why are you here? I was personally requested to attend." That's really something. One of Lihaku's good qualities was that he didn't think too hard about things. Maomao had spoken to him without really thinking, but perhaps this wasn't the best time to reveal who her acquaintances were. "You know, it was the same for me," Lihaku said. "Somebody asked for me by name to be part of the guard unit." He sounded somewhat put out by this, though he continued to stroke the dog's belly. The animal wore a collar, and Maomao surmised from the breed that it was a hunting dog. Unfortunately for him, they would be hunting with hawks today. The dog would just have to cool his heels. That must have been why he and Lihaku were here, holding down camp instead. You just keep an eye on the dog," they said. Evidently, though he'd been asked for by name, the other bodyguards, themselves proud men, all had effectively ostracized him. Lihaku had been rising in the world recently. However, the higher he went, the fiercer the resistance became. Lihaku pursed his lips, but he wasn't upset. He was making a ridiculous FSSH sound, pushing the breath out of his mouth. He seemed to think he was whistling. "You are very bad at that, sir." "Yes, thank you, be quiet." He gave Maomao a smack on the head, then pulled at a string around his neck. This produced a long, narrow tube that looked somewhat like a flute. Lihaku had given up on whistling, so he put the cylinder to his lips and blew on it in the dog's direction. The animal jumped up and looked right at him. With a series of long and short blows, he could make the dog sit and stand when he gave a command. "He looks very smart." "Sure is. When I need him, I can get him to come running from kilometers away." Then he gave 3 short bursts on the whistle, followed by 4 longer ones. The dog came over and sat in front of him, wagging his tail. "He is so smart, but they want to use that." He looked at the sky. Maomao followed his gaze. Above them in the blue sky, she saw a tiny black speck circling. She thought that when hunting in the mountains, which had many physical obstacles, it was probably wiser to use a dog than a hawk. But perhaps hawks carried more prestige. Maomao would not turn down some wild rabbit, though she dearly wished for some boar meat instead. They were not going to catch a boar with a bird. Maomao contemplated what a good forest this was. A wide variety of trees grew here. And that likely meant a wide variety of fine medicinal herbs and mushrooms. She thought they probably did not want her going in there. She was feeling fidgety. She glanced around. Lihaku was completely absorbed in playing with the dog. She did not think anyone would notice her, but still she wondered. She started looking around, and almost before she realized it, the sun had passed its highest point. The air was full of the fragrance of sizzling meat. They were at the mountain retreat, where the wine flowed freely and women brought the cooked game around. About 10 officials were seated in chairs. A table nearby held several side dishes. The room was designed for good airflow, and buckets of water were placed at their feet. Servants with large fans were also present. Every effort had obviously been made to relieve the stultifying heat of the summer hunt. Shihokushu had a cooler climate, as it should for a place people visited to escape the heat. However, today, the pleasant weather and the damp breeze combined to make everything feel warm. Servants came by with food, offering it kindly. They had cooked additional meat to supplement the catch from the hunt. The hunt's yield wouldn't have been enough for everyone. However, unlike fish, game was not necessarily at its tastiest immediately after being caught. Maomao stood behind Gaeshun, watching the proceedings with detachment. Gaeshun had a seat of his own. Attendant girls and palace women stood at attention behind the various officials. "You know, now that I think about it." Outside his master's room, Gaeshun did not spend much time with Jinchi. Instead, Basin attended him, and Maomao naturally fell in with Gaoshan. A strange-looking man occupied the seat of honor. His face was hidden behind a mask, and he hadn't touched his food. The wine wasn't bad either. Basin stood attentively behind him. Did he have to wear that thing even here? It must be tough, Maomao thought. She didn't feel it particularly concerned her, though. The girls serving the alcohol kept stealing glances at the masked visitor, who was, of course, Jinchi. However odd his choice of accessories might have been, he was the most important guest here. To become the mistress of a high official would almost certainly bring more security than marrying someone of only moderate standing. All the ladies present seemed intelligent enough to understand this. It was not only the women who paid him attention. The large man seated next to Jinchi was constantly whispering to him. It was a very intimate way of speaking. Perhaps it was Maomao's imagination that made Jinchi's voice sound a little impertinent. Jinchi kept responding with quick nods. So is that Shishu? Maomao wondered. She had heard his name before, but she didn't know his face very well, or at least she didn't quite remember it. His seat's location was a strong indicator of who he was. I wonder what they are talking about. Shishu stopped speaking and leaned away from Jinchi. Jinchi's hand continued to tremble, and Basin looked even paler. Did something he said bother them? She leaned over and whispered to Gaoshan. She knew Jinchi very well. She might think what she liked about his personality, but his outward appearance was always unflappable. It was strange to see him acting that way. She told Gaoshan that she thought something might be wrong with him. Gaoshan shook his head and told her not to do anything. Jinchi stood up and said he had a little business to take care of. Basin was about to go to him, but some high officials delayed him. Gaoshan tugged on Maomao's sleeve. It's time to trade off, he said. Maomao understood what he meant. She nodded, then called one of the other servants who was waiting outside the room. Then she followed Jinchi as he walked unsteadily. He left the residence, being careful that no one noticed him, and headed toward the trees. Maomao was going to have to follow him, but first she needed something. She picked up a long-necked bottle full of water. May I take this? She asked a servant who was preparing food. Sure, go ahead. The servant, obviously harried, answered without really looking at her. Maomao used a spoon to add a little something to the water. Then she took it with her toward the woods. Shortly after entering the trees, she spotted a figure leaning against one of the trunks. Master J, she was about to say Jinchi, but clapped a hand over her mouth before the name could get out. She did not know why, but he was using a pseudonym here. What was it again? She tried to remember. It's you, a strained voice said from behind the mask before she could call the name to mind. You need to take this off, she said, and made to pry the mask off his face, but Jinchi resisted fiercely. I can't. Of course you can. There is no one here. Was that not why he had come all the way out here? There was nowhere to be alone in the residence. Jinchi had his own quarters, to be sure, but palace women were always there, perpetually ready to meet his every need. But someone might come. Arg, this is so frustrating. Maomao leaned the wobbly man against her shoulder and began to pull him along. If you are that worried about somebody seeing, then you just need to go somewhere nobody will be. Deeper into the woods they went. She could see a cliffside now with a beautiful, massive waterfall. The spray was captivating. It looked like a white feather cloak such as one of the gods might wear. The waterfall cascaded down several steps. It must have been an overwhelming sight even from above. Maomao realized this was where the water was gathered from. She dipped her handkerchief in the river, then slipped it under Jinchi's mask, hoping to cool his face. Then the ground around their feet exploded. What? There was a noisy flapping of wings as birds scattered. Jinchi was the first to react. He grabbed Maomao in his arms and started running. Once again the dirt at their feet flew into the air. A breeze carried a distinctive sulphurous smell. Could that be a Fafer? Jinchi hissed, still moving unsteadily. He seemed strikingly calm considering the unexpected development. The Fafer, meaning flying explosion, was a weapon that utilized fire powder. It was sometimes used in hunting, but it would be hard to claim this particular incident was simply a mistake. Jinchi thought for a moment, then tightened his grip on Maomao. Sorry, this is going to get a little dramatic. He started running with Maomao in his arms, then he leaped for the waterfall. A little my ass, Maomao thought as they plummeted into the spray. Chapter 18. The Hunt, Part 2, the soldiers serving as bodyguards were clearly distressed. The officials were talking amongst themselves, occasionally looking at Basin with exasperation. It had been 2 full hours since his master had left his seat. That was well beyond a reasonable time to answer the call of nature. Basin knew it was too late to regret not accompanying Jinshi. Jinshi had specifically told him to stay behind anyway. Basin had seen his father give instructions to the maid who was always with them. Basin grunted and furrowed his brow. Everyone told him he looked like his father when he did that. At this moment, however, his father Gaeshun remained expressionless. He was simply observing what was happening. Basin was directly involved, but today Gaeshun was a bystander. He was acting like the other officials. Basin desperately wanted to ask his father what he should do, but he couldn't approach him under the circumstances. Instead, he tried to imagine where his master might be. He also tried to ignore the annoyance of the other officials. He had already sent one of his subordinates to search. Truth be told, he wished he could have gone personally. He was sickened to be stuck in a role that seemed purely formal. All he could do was wait for his man to get back. One of the servants claimed to have seen Jinshi leave the building. The servant said he was going to get some air. He had told the guards not to follow him, but a petite lady in waiting went after him with some water. Basin knew who that must have been, and it only made him more certain that something had happened. He shouldn't have just waited here. At the moment, there were 2 distinctly different attitudes among those present. Some were worried about their missing master, and others were openly amused that he had disappeared for so long with a serving girl. Basin was particularly furious at the idiots in this second group. He stopped himself from arguing with them openly. He wanted to exclaim that it would never happen, but instead he tapped his foot compulsively against the floor. The atmosphere at the banquet was quickly turning sour. Basin felt as if Shishu could have put things back on the right footing with just a word. However, their host was too busy pouring wine into his portly, tanuki-like belly. Basin couldn't imagine what he was thinking. His teacher, Shishu, would never have reached his position without being exactly who he was. However, from that perspective, there was one man who might have been able to surpass him. That man was the strategist Lacan, yet it was widely understood that Lacan had no such ambitions. The man people called eccentric, strange, and bizarre had recently bought a courtesan. He was shut up with her instead of attending this hunt. His absence wasn't particularly remarkable. What had the court chattering was the realization that the monocled eccentric had actual human feelings. All this being said, Shishu was the host of this banquet. He was hardly in a position to carry out any plots personally. Basin dearly hoped that nothing untoward would happen while he was attending his master. He suspected that if something did occur, it would be instigated by someone other than Shishu. He believed their host would not be involved. Then, a soldier ran up. He was muscular and still young, and his footfalls pounded on the floor. "Pardon me, sirs," he said as he entered the banquet hall and stood before Basin. It wasn't quite proper, but nobody stopped him. The soldier knelt before Basin, who told him to look up. "What is it?" Basin asked. In response, the soldier glanced around the room, then passed Basin a piece of cloth. He recognized the damp, shredded fabric immediately. He took in the soldier's expression. He was desperate to glance over at his father to see what he might be thinking. He suppressed the urge, clutching the cloth tighter. Is that an official reached out, but Basin hid the cloth from him. He did not raise his eyes from the ground as he said, "A piece of my master's robe." He looked at the soldier, carefully expressionless. The young man looked at the ground again. He said, "I found it hanging on a rock in the waterfall basin." This set the room buzzing. So the missing guest had torn his robe. The soldier continued, "There was no one in the area." He added, "The river is rapid there, however, and swollen by the recent rains." The people who had been snickering over the visitor's assignation with one of the ladies went pale. "Send out a search party immediately," someone shouted, but it was a little late for that. Guests began to pour out of the banquet hall. Soon, only a handful of people remained, including Basin, the soldier who had brought the report, and Shishu. The soldier glanced in the direction of those who had left, then he stood. "If I may, sir, I am going to go back to where I found that and have another look around," he said. Then he left as well. Basin pretended not to have noticed that the soldier grinned when he looked up. Basin left the residence, instructing 2 of his subordinates to stay behind at the banquet hall. Those who had shared Basin's concern for his master had already sent their men to search when Basin first asked. Now only the scoffers were stumbling over themselves to look useful. Basin heard some of the other guests shout to him, and he answered them offhandedly, but what he was really doing was looking around. He found the soldier who had reported to him. The soldier was now with a dog that sniffed around, searching for something. It looked like a hunting animal tracking game. Then one of the officials passed in front of the dog and it began howling. "What the hell?" the man exclaimed, cringing to find himself the object of all this noise. "I'm very sorry, sir," the dog's handler said. "Just get him away from me," the man demanded. The soldier pulled the dog back, but now the animal barked at the official's subordinate. The man and his underling moved away, clearly thinking they were dealing with an ill-trained hunting animal. After another 30 minutes of searching, someone shouted from the direction of the waterfall. A group of guests had gathered downstream from the basin. A torn robe lay there with dark red spots. A broken arrow was stuck through it. "What is going on here?" Basin asked. The people who found the robe shook their heads. The tear in the outfit matched the piece of cloth that had been found before. Water had faded the red stains, but they were unmistakably blood. The stains clearly showed where the arrow had struck. The owner of the robe was nowhere to be seen. If the robe had been carried to them by the current, then he must be upstream. But if the arrow had caught the outfit and the owner had wriggled out of it, then he might be downstream. There were no wet marks on the banks of the river, though, making it unlikely he had climbed out there. Basin looked at the torn piece of cloth and frowned. "Show me the arrow." One of his men passed him the broken projectile. He inspected the tail feathers and the head. Then he turned toward the still growing crowd of officials and announced, "I apologize, but we are going to have to search everyone's belongings." The arrow had been fletched with hawk feathers. Those were expensive items, which limited the number of people who could use them. Many of the guests on this expedition, knowing hawks would be used in the hunting, had superstitiously brought supplies decorated with hawk feathers. What is more, each of these items had been painstakingly handcrafted by professional craftsmen. The highborn disliked seeing a design repeated. Even for consumables like arrows, they preferred uniqueness. Each of them could be expected to carry arrows of exceptional construction and materials. Though obviously displeased to be objects of suspicion, the guests reluctantly complied. Each produced hunting implements from his carriage, appearing confident that no such arrow would be found among his belongings. "Can you explain this to me?" Basin asked icily. "Just what is that?" responded the distressed owner of the arrow Basin was holding. His name was Lo En, a high official of the board that handled finance, but his title or station mattered little at the moment. His abundant beard was trembling as he denied any knowledge of the arrow. "I don't own anything like this," he said. "There must be some mistake." He shivered and gesticulated quite a bit. The onlookers started murmuring. Suspicious glances began to turn toward Lo En. Despite what the man said, the broken arrow in Basin's hand perfectly matched the ones in Lo En's baggage. "Please explain how it's a mistake," Basin said. "Somebody must have planted those there to frame me." Lo En's face was drawn with panic, and his servants shared his distress. They were all obviously deeply shaken by this utterly unexpected turn of events. Lone's defense started the crowd talking again. They seemed to agree that only an inordinately clumsy criminal would keep a quiver full of the arrows used in the crime. The soldier with the dog stood behind Basin, watching the scene as if he wanted to comment. Basin studied the shred of cloth again. Then perhaps the arrows that were switched out were thrown away somewhere nearby. His gaze took in the residence and all the scenery around it. "We have searched the riverbanks fairly thoroughly, so perhaps it is time to start looking in the woods." Somebody flinched at that. It was a very slight movement, but someone watching carefully would have noticed it. "Would this person take the bait?" Basin asked. "Shall we split up and search? I do not need everyone here. If about half of you could help me look for my master, that would be enough." No one dared object to this proposal. Lo En and his party were still recovering their wits. Basin let out a sigh and looked at the soldier behind him. The man gave him a friendly smile. This would do it, Basin thought. He looked at the torn robe, openly annoyed. The fabric bore familiar handwriting. The man looked around, panicked, wondering if anyone would show up. He was sure they couldn't possibly find it. However, having everyone look for him was still unsettling. He was certain they would never find it, but that thought led him to move closer. He was in the woods, surrounded by piles of fallen leaves and soft soil. The leaves were neatly scattered, so it wouldn't be noticeable at a quick glance. If those determined men started rooting through the leaves and digging in the ground, that might be a problem. What should he do? The man was flustered. Why had that been there? The question hounded him. Maybe that was what made him more panicky than usual. When he arrived at his destination, he breathed a sigh of relief.